Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, hello everyone and welcome to the June 2019 LawHelp Interactive Community Call. My name is Marinda Migueli and I'm really excited to be joined today by an amazing guest panelist. We have Dan Kass from JustFix.NYC. We also have LHI's Program Manager, Claudia Johnson, as well as Mark Lauritsen from Capstone Practice Systems. And I want to extend a warm welcome today for those joining the call, whether it's your first time or your 35th time. We're happy to have you here and we hope you find the call informative. So just as a reminder, for those who know or who may not know, we record all LHI community calls and make them available in the LHI Resource Center. So I will add a link to the chat box so you can see where to access that recording, and I'll be adding links throughout the call to the chat box that are referenced in the slides. We will also upload a copy of these slides to the LHI Resource Center. And here's today's agenda. So we're going to start with our presentation on an exciting integration between the JustFix.NYC platform with LawHelp Interactive. After our presentation, we'll move to general updates, and we've carved out time for questions, comments, and discussion, but we encourage you to engage and ask questions and make comments throughout the call. You can do that by raising your hand or sending a note in the chat box, and we will keep an eye on that panel as administrators so that we can get to your questions and get to your comments throughout the call. So I'm going to ask Dan to talk a little bit about JustFix.NYC.
Okay. Hey, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Cool. So hi, everyone. We're so excited to be here together with LHI. So again, my name is Dan. I'm a co-founder and the executive director at JustFix.NYC. We are a nonprofit organization based here in New York with a mission to develop both data and technology for both tenants as well as tenant advocates who are fighting displacement here in New York. We have been around since about 2015. And the thing that I'm really excited to talk about a little bit today is we follow a community-driven design approach to the different sorts of tools and services that we've built in coordination with the housing justice movement here in New York. Great. So I would definitely encourage everyone who's just learning about us for the first time or wants more information to visit our website at JustFix.NYC. You can see that in the bottom. But just super quickly, we currently, one thing to note is that we are in a constant process of iterating and adapting our services and evolving things that are working and looking at things that aren't working. So at this current moment in time, these are the 4 services that are in use here in the city. So the first one, which I'll talk about today, is a mobile web application, which again is a website that works really well on your phone. That's dedicated for tenants who are dealing with repair or harassment issues and guides them through the process of sending letters, working with the city, and what we're here to talk about today, which is actually following legal actions. We have another website called Who Owns What, which is a data tool that's used by tenants and organizers to research buildings and landlords. It does this critical sort of connection of mapping landlord portfolios beyond shell company networks. Our third service is called Eviction Free NYC, which was developed with the Right to Counsel Coalition here in New York, in line with the new Right to Counsel law that provides tenants with access to legal representation if they're in eviction proceedings. And the fourth one is our newest one. It's the baby of the mix, and it's an experiment in text message-based services. A big focus of ours is on accessibility and usability. And so we're experimenting with increasingly having services that are almost predominantly led or almost exclusively delivered through SMS. And so again, I would encourage folks to reach out to me afterwards or go to the website to be able to find out more about these other services. Great. Miranda, you want me to jump in here for LSNYC? Yeah, I guess I'm not hearing. So, yeah. So just to speak towards LSNYC, Marika, who's been the point person from the org, wasn't able to join, unfortunately. But LSNYC is one of our biggest partners here in New York. You know, again, at JustFix, we work with both legal service organizations as well as community groups. And one of the biggest legal service organizations here in the city is Legal Services NYC. They are the largest provider of free legal services for low-income people in the country. Just to also speak to the scale and complexity of operating here in New York, which is always a fun challenge. They you know, provide a pretty wide variety of different sorts of housing and tenants' rights sorts of interventions. You know, of course, eviction prevention, supporting group-wide actions in terms of tenant associations and community organizing groups, helping with subsidies, et cetera. And one of the biggest areas that we saw that they were, had classically sort of struggled to support tenants with was on what we call it, what we define as the informal eviction side. So an informal eviction is where tenants are being denied repairs in their apartment, or just the apartment is intentionally fallen into disrepair, or there's other active tactics of landlord harassment that are drivers of displacement, you know, things that the landlord are doing to get the tenant out of their apartment. For LSNYC, it's always been a slightly difficult area to assist tenants with, given that tenants are largely on their own through some of these processes. It's a huge area where there's a large number of pro se litigants. So it was something that we had been discussing with LSNYC for several years about how our services could complement their, you know, their need to more effectively address tenants in those sorts of situations. And they, to that end, had established a clinic program, which is what this part of what our joint partnership has been based around, which were in-person clinics that would happen in each borough. So at its height, there were 5 clinics each month that tenants would be able to be referred to, that they would work with both attorneys as well as paralegals and eventually volunteer staff to learn about the HP action process, which is the legal process that we're talking about today. Learn about it, understand it, get assistance, and be able to get the sort of paperwork they need to then be able to go and file the forms. And so we'll definitely get into that later, but that's sort of the legal aid provider partner in this project.
Hey Dan, just quickly, it looks like Miranda got knocked off, and so we're not seeing her screens at the moment. So just be aware, people are asking the question. People aren't crazy. The screen sharing is momentarily off. It should be reestablished shortly.
Let me see if I can.
Maybe you can do it directly.
Yeah. Sorry about that, everyone.
And we're back.
All right, so this is me. So I'm going to go full screen. Great. So that was LSNYC. Unfortunately, if Miranda's gone, I'm not sure Claudia or anyone from the LHI wants to give a brief overview.
Kiske is here. Perhaps she can say something.
Well,
Hello. Oh,
hi,
go ahead. Yeah,
Christine.
Claudia. Yes,
Yeah,
perfect.
I didn't know if you want to cover anything on the New York activity that Dan was talking about before.
Well, after you do about LawHelp Interactive, I
Okay.
can talk about LawHelp New York.
Okay. Yeah, so LawHelp Interactive, we're a national platform and a best practices training center. We've been around since 2006 as a product, and we are now working with 14 states and thousands of legal nonprofits and librarians and pro bono groups that are using LHI to create easy to use online forums, either for self-represented or unrepresented litigants, but also for pro bono lawyers who may not be experts in that area of law, and even for their own staff when they're really trying to expedite pleading creation. And we do monthly calls like this. We help one-on-one. We do national trainings teaching people how to author forms. And then we try to work with groups that are doing amazing work in substantive areas of law, like JustFix and landlord-tenant work, and try to do integrations that make it a lot easier and faster for somebody who is in need of creating a document to create the document without having um, to work through like a complex form process. So that's our role. And so in this is a project that we've been doing as part of a TIG grant, LSC TIG grant, and we're really happy to share how far we've come along and talk a little bit more about how the integration works in New York State. And mind you that landlord tenant is a really state by state, sometimes county by county law. So this project really reflects New York law. Some of the proceedings and remedies in other counties may not be exactly the same, but this type of integration is something that could be considered to reduce barriers for those that are either pre-litigation or actually now dealing with a notice of eviction.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi, sorry, this is Miranda. I've lost my audio for a moment.
Okay.
Okay. So, Claudia, were you able to talk a little bit about LHI for the folks who may have joined today or are not familiar with the platform?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So now
Cool. So in that case, if you want to the website,
Yep.
and then LawHelp New York.
So my name is Kiske Addison. I'm the program director for LawHelp New York. LawHelp New York is the legal information referral statewide website in New York State, and we also offer trainings and a robust live help project that helps about 11,000 people per year. For this project, we worked at this project with LSNYC and LHI after a few years ago, and then at that time what we did is we created a small microsite with information and resources and tools. But what's great about this project is this allows us a way to integrate various tools, not just ones through Pro Bono Net, into one experience. And we've shared that with a new and updated microsite, which we can show a little bit later.
Great, thanks, Kiskea. And this may have already been covered, so apologies for the redundancy, but I was logged out. But just to take a step back, this project sponsor is Legal Services NYC. Dan was able to talk a little bit about the great work that they're doing in New York City. LSNYC received TIG funding to help with cover the cost of this integration so that tenants in New York could complete high-quality forms to request apartment repairs and address landlord harassment. Kiske just talked about the microsite. So the forms and information are made available in the context of the microsite, but the technology generally is not really developed in isolation, but rather seen as part of an existing ecosystem of tenant advocacy work and legal advocacy and legal assistance. It's been used and piloted in existing tenants' rights clinics, and it's really seen as a way to augment existing services and models available.
Great. And yeah, so we'll are really excited to do some live demoing of what this looks like in a little bit. But just to speak a little bit about what specifically this integration has looked like between JustFix and LHI. So I'd say, the two primary things that we are able to produce at JustFix.NYC is both, technology that is, built around accessibility, that is built around, the use of through mobile phones, again, optimized for the use on a mobile device, but not exclusively on a mobile device. As well as a design process that is able to really involve key stakeholders in the process in a way that helps us ensure that the technology that we're deploying, like Miranda said, is done in the context of what's currently happening in the ecosystem. And is ultimately driven by the users of the technology itself. So that's what I'll love to talk a little bit about how we at JustFix go about that process. But just to start, the integration from a very simple level was one in which we have been at JustFix designing the interface that tenants used to complete the process of creating these HP action forms. Built as part of, to be as a feature within the larger JustFix product. So when someone comes to JustFix.NYC, not only are they pointed towards, doing this legal process, but even before that, we point them towards non-legal sorts of actions that they can take, which might help drive results in their situation. So the first thing that someone does when they sign up for JustFix is we streamline the process of them sending a certified notice of complaint to the landlord. So an important part for the HP action process down the road is that they have are able to prove to the courts that they have sent this sort of notice that the landlord has been notified of the issues, and so that's something that we can completely streamline for them. In some cases, the landlords receive the certified notice that's sent by JustFix and are able to come to the table and actually go in and make repairs, in which case the tenant doesn't even have to go through the legal process at all. And of course, in many situations where there is a more negligent landlord or a more complex situation, this is now allow the tenant to be that much more prepared to explore that legal avenue. So again, we were able to build this into our existing interface that was designed for tenants to be able to use, and critically integrated with the document assembly system in use by LawHelp Interactive. This is a really well-working, well-tested document assembly system. It's already in use by the courts, which I think was a really critical piece for the context of this project. That it's something that the New York State courts we're already familiar with, and I think that was something that has been very important in getting buy-in from the courts as well. And so, yeah, in many ways, we were excited for the potential of this integration from a technical level. So to talk a little bit about how we started to really go about the design side of it, the first sort of part of our process was in an assessment phase. So what the assessment phase, entailed was particularly working with LSNYC to understand the process of how they operate as a legal aid organization. So you can see a little bit of that here of how their hotline connects to their clinic program. At what points are tenants entering into this process? What sorts of information is required from them at different stages? And really keeping things open-ended as to just get a better understanding of what this process looks like, most importantly from a tenant's perspective. So, what it influenced for us in terms of the design of the technology was also understanding possible opportunities that we had. So you can see in blue here, these were all ideas that we were able to really start to brainstorm on. For example, most of the tenants who are registered for this legal clinic call in through this hotline program. And so an early idea that's actually been put into practice is that the hotline provider can actually send an SMS to the tenant who's called with a link to sign up for JustFix that allows the tenant to already get together the materials that they would need to come to the clinic program already prepared, have reminders of when the clinic program would be, so we can ensure that they're attending. Little things like that helped us really understand what opportunities technology could afford in really streamlining this process for a pro se tenant, who is really just looking for repairs first and foremost. So the second part of it, which is very similar, is what we call sort of journey mapping. This is a pretty popular concept in design, and similar to understanding the clinic process. This journey map or these diagrams were meant to really understand what does the entire sort of litigation process look like for a self-represented individual. And so it was really, really instrumental to have the training materials that the clinic provided to their attorneys and to the folks that supervise the clinic, because that allowed us to really adapt that sort of institutional knowledge onto further outlining what a self-represented tenant would have to accomplish. And so I know it's probably pretty small, but what you can see here is an understanding of different things around the persona of the tenants. That tenants who are looking to file this sort of legal intervention more often than not have already repeatedly requested repairs from the landlord. They probably have already completed some of these steps, like notifying the city, maybe getting an inspection. Oftentimes folks coming to file an HP action had already filed one in the past, which was significant. And so, this was also done through a lot of interviewing with tenants, with folks in court and outside of court. Again, really for us to be able to outline the perspective that ultimately drives the design of the interface that we're looking to provide to tenants. So the third piece here, which is really starting to translate our sense of what the user's journey is. And again, the journey, it's important to note that this is the analog journey. So this is within the absence of any designed technology. What does this look like if the technology didn't exist, or what currently the process was? So we use a design approach that's called priority guides. I've sort of linked to it here. If you search for priority guides, you'll find a fantastic article on a design blog about it. And what priority guides help with is translating, I think a lot of folks here, are very familiar with the challenge of very text-heavy experiences that include a lot of legal information, but oftentimes can be overwhelming for the end user. So what priority guides do, it's a process of understanding which content is the most important. How does the user experience, how does the user need to navigate through things in order to really try to prioritize and simplify both the text as well as the user interface elements as much as possible to drive just a very simple, easy to use sort of experience. And of course, the final thing, which has been prevalent through all of those processes and continues on after we have built, our initial versions of the software, is, feedback and testing. At JustFix, we like to think of a process like this as having many different users that are, have a lot of importance in these processes. Of course, tenants and potential users of this are critical, folks to involve very thoroughly in the design and feedback process. Every iteration of the tool that we've built has been tested with over a dozen, at each phase, individual tenant users who we get a ton of feedback from. But in the same sense, we also consider the courts to be users of this as well. Understanding the processes that the clerks who are filing, who need to handle the paperwork that's being filed, have to go through, and trying to alleviate, not make their lives more difficult, I should say. Working with judges, we've had some fantastic individual judges within the state court system that have been great internal advocates of this project. Another great sort of program that we were able to partner with was a law clinic at Columbia Law School. A recurring clinic called Lawyering in the Digital Age, where each semester we had a team of law school students that were working with us to understand some of the legal constraints The previous semester they did a deep dive into the various legal statutes around what constitutes tenant harassment, and have been really great partners in doing, creating a plain language versions of some of these forms, of understanding some of the internal workings of the courts to help inform on our strategy. And so, really looking at the different sorts of stakeholders that we can align with to ensure that the project has success, that it isn't just, sending out this piece of software in the world, but is really done, as Miranda said earlier, in the context of these pre-existing processes that ensure more adoption, investment, and ultimately engagement within the program. Great. So on that front, I'll give a quick demo of what the interface currently looks like, assuming that we're still good on time and process and everything.
Yes, please go ahead with the demo.
Okay. Awesome. So, a couple of things to note here, if everyone can see my screen. Like I mentioned, the JustFix service is first and foremost a website. That's done for accessibility reasons, versus building an app that you would have to download on your phone. A website, I can use it on a desktop computer like this, or it's also just optimized to work really well on a phone. This allows this to just be used in a broad sort of set of contexts. The other thing to note here, and this has been sort of driven from all this usability and accessibility testing, is we're very cognizant of the fact that there's always going to be folks who are left out of this process. No matter how simple and accessible you build your technology, there will be folks who are not able to use it. And I'm talking non-native English speakers, elderly folks that don't have access to technology. And so one of the things that's been really relevant to our design process is also looking at how advocates can use these tools on behalf of the folks that they're working with. So for the folks that in these LSNYC clinics are able to, in many cases, they're equipped with iPads within the clinic program, or other tablets, or maybe they just have their office computer, that an advocate could be doing this process for a tenant just as much as the tenant could be doing it for themselves. And the other thing to note here is that this we don't consider to be our final version of this process. What you're seeing now is still a beta. We are just about to launch our version sort of 1.0. But again, just speaking to the iterative process of constantly, building small features at a time, getting feedback on them, and continuing to, iterate over time, and boiling down to, how accessible is this language? Our folks who we're testing with, we'll ask them questions afterwards to sort of even assess, did this language resonate? Is it accomplishing what we want it to, et cetera, et cetera. So where I'm starting from is the perspective of someone who already has an account. So it's already saying, in this case, my test username is Patricia. So I've already created an account. I could be someone who's already done the letter sending process and has come back to the service. We send automated text message follow-up. So if you send a letter through JustFix after about a month, you'll receive a text saying, hey, did anything happen? And if not, we're able to point people back to this screen to consider an HP action. Or again, it could be done as part of the clinic program in person or something like that. So include a couple of instructional materials, but the first thing to jump into here is selecting their repair issues. So this has been a feature that we've had on JustFix for a long time. The tenants are able to go through and select on a case-by-case basis the types of repair issues that they're experiencing. Also a free-form text area where they can outline, if anything that we haven't captured through our list directly. And one of the great things that this provides is, as you'll see on the forums later on, one challenge is that oftentimes tenants are basically just given a blank form to write out the things that they're experiencing. And so this helps to synthesize the types of repair issues, as also give them some inspiration. Oftentimes tenants looking at this list will say, oh, I didn't even think about that as an issue, but I guess that's actually something I'm experiencing, and so they'll add that to the checklist. And it really is important for these forms to, include the most number, the highest number of issues possible to get everything in, because if you haven't been able to report something, it won't be counted as part of the legal determination. So it really helps things be more thorough. So the next step here is assessing for children. You'll see later on this helps to get at different sorts of legal statutes around, I'm going to say this is a very recently born person. This gets at some legal statutes around lead paint restrictions, and so it's a special question that the city asks for on their inspection sheets. We'll ask a basic question, again, some random questions here, and these questions are actually the ones that we're actively testing at the moment. And so it's a bit of a strategy. You can see up here step 4 of 17. We're actually keeping a lot of these questions separate, knowing eventually maybe they would be better streamlined as one set. But keeping them individualized is, again, for testing purposes, that we can sort of keep them siloed and be able to test each question sort of individually. You can see we can do really dynamic things of having logic behind these questions, yes, no questions driving other ones and things like that. Great. And yeah, as you can see, our process, again, these are the questions that are supposed to outline tenant harassment. This is something that we've been working on for a long time and are still in progress with. Translating these directly from the legal forms, you can see that there's a lot of legalese, there's a lot of complexity in the questions. And so as we iterate on each step of this tool, we're able to start to really synthesize each of these questions down. So the final version of this, of course, will look much more simplified than as it even currently looks. See, it can be, this is, again, just copied directly from how the forms are asking tenants to supply this information. So we have a great step here. Another part of this process is filing for a fee waiver. And again, things that we're able to do very intelligently, which is, do some of the calculations that the end user might have to do on their own, pen and paper, in terms of calculating expenses and things like that, which I think will be, this next question here. So these questions are able to, we're able to, do a quick calculation that will then be put directly on the form. And I hope no one thinks that any of those are actual questions, or actual answers. I'm just making up numbers there. And so this final step here is one that we're particularly excited about. So of course, one of the biggest pieces of information you need when suing your landlord is the actual who your landlord actually is. This has been a major barrier to tenants looking to file these papers because oftentimes folks don't know who their landlord is. It might be that they have the contact information of a super. It could be that they're sending their rent to a PO box or anything like that. And oftentimes their forms can be invalidated if they haven't actually been able to supply the correct information. Because this data is data that's publicly available through New York's open data law, we're actually able to integrate it directly into the experience. And so this information was driven by the address I put in when I registered. We're essentially able to say, this is the official city record of who your landlord is, and this is who needs to be on the forms for you to successfully file that. And that's something that we're able to completely alleviate from the user's point of view. That's just data that we bring in directly into the experience. So I'll go ahead and generate the forms. And yep, can tend to take a few seconds. Bear with us. Oh no. Well, unfortunately, we had a bug. That's a good part of the testing process. So what I'll do in the meantime is bring up a sample one. Great. So what you can see here is this is the packet that tenants are provided that are able to download, and we're actually just working on a feature now, which could be why that bug appeared, which allows them to receive this packet by email as well. And additionally, email if they're working with someone, let's say in the clinic, that person can receive the packet as an email as well. You can imagine one of the logistical barriers here is the printing problem. And so that's something that we have been working on with folks that have active presence in the courts, who are staffing help tables and are able to print on behalf of tenants and things like that, as well as an eventual dream of this being done by e-filing as well, which we have had conversations with the courts on. But what you can see here really simply is rendered forms. Some of my favorite things about LHI are things that you can see here, which is, on the forms, they really give you these short little text boxes here, this 1 through 9 that you can see sort of at the top. That's as much space as the tenant is provided to list out the repair issues that they're experiencing, which is almost never enough space. And so something great that LHI does is taken from that checklist that I showed you in the demo. They're able to automatically create an addendum. You can see on line 1, it says see addendum incorporated herein. Then the next page will just list out all those issues, a lot more space, done to the specifications of the courts as well. And so, a ton of little things like that are just heavily, great convenience measures to include within the form packets. So we're able to include with the tenants the petition that they need to file, the inspection request form that gets then sent to the city agency. So part of the court process would also be getting an inspection, as well as the complete fee waiver paperwork as well. And in the great thing about this as well is just the amount of great instructional materials that are included. So these are a previous version of this instructional copy. But what we're able to experiment with and are really refining is the fact that our instructional copy can also be as personalized and tailored to the user as possible. So users in each court, each of the 5 boroughs can get specific sorts of instructions as to say what rooms they need to go to that are unique to Brooklyn or Queens, what steps in the process they need to send each part of the forms to and things like that. And so not only are folks coming into the courts equipped with all the forms that they need, they have the exact perfect sort of instructions that have likewise been user tested to make sure that they're simple, clear, and understandable to walk them through how actually to use the forms as well. So I think that's where I'll leave things. But yeah, very excited to hear questions and to use this as a starting point for further discussion.
Thanks so much, Dan. So I'll open things up for questions. If you'd like to raise your hand and have audio, please do that. If you want to send a question in the chat box, we'll be looking at those as well. And can folks see my screen?
Yep.
We do, yes.
Okay, so it looks like we have a question that came in. Oh, it's just a comment that you can see the screen. So thanks for confirming that. Okay, I have one.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mark.
Just a question to get things started. I was impressed by the ability to ascertain the landlord and the contact information for the landlord based upon the tenant's registration. Does that all happen on the JustFix website, and then that data gets passed to LHI to be inserted into documents or into the tenant's answer file? Maybe that's too loose a question, but I'm curious the mechanics of that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that speaks to, I think, some of the benefits of this partnership. So, here in New York, the work that we do at JustFix, we are constantly immersed in the types of data that the city provides. So, not just this landlord data, but we also have data that we're really looking to integrate around actually the specific sort of code violations that could be also supplied into the forms as well. And so that's an area where we know that data super well. We can put all that data together and then send it to LHI, which is able to then incorporate it into the forum. So on the LHI side, they don't need to be jumping through a lot of hoops to do specific integrations with a specific, locality's data. But at JustFix, that's stuff that we, we use day in, day out.
Cool.
Thanks, Dan. We have another question. Do you have figures on how many people have used the app, and how do you measure outcomes? Are you able to track success?
Yeah, so I can put that one. From the JustFix side, so we are just at the verge of launching publicly this integration. So all the folks who have used this HP Action integration specifically have been either within the LSNYC clinics or have been test users from JustFix. But our previous versions of our tool have been live since about the end of 2015. And we've had over 10,000 folks that have used the tool. We measure outcomes in terms of of course how repairs are being completed. Ultimately, we're an anti-displacement organization, and so what we're most interested in tracking is that this relationship between repairs and displacements, where landlord harassment is a figure there. So how effectively we can ultimately keep folks in their homes. Also just understanding the limitations that technology provides, right? So we think about that, but we don't necessarily compare ourselves to a public, a legal aid attorney or a community organizer when thinking about that. So the opportunity with JustFix is that we're not nearly as effective as working with a person, but we can reach tens of thousands of people in the services that we provide. The other sort of major area that we track is really in terms of the timeline. So when folks file the letter to their landlord, like I mentioned, we have automated text messages that are sent to the users at key moments in time, starting from the day that the letter is sent all the way up to about a month later. And so what we're really trying to assess is, how strong are each of these interventions? Likewise, we're going to be doing something very similar for folks that create the HP Action forms. So what we want to see is folks who use each of these discrete actions, how likely are those actions to drive an outcome, as well as how long does it really take from the tenant's side of view to really get things done? Does it take them a couple of months of sending a letter and then going to court, or how can we effectively really reduce that timeline so that ultimately tenants have the tools that they need and can avoid the court process whenever possible.
Thanks, Dan. And I think you get at this, but really we're looking at the whole project. The question was about the app, but I imagine it's about the whole project. And so that means synthesizing data. So that means looking at how many people were successful in terms of the LHI assembly, how many people are registering for the clinics hosted by LSNYC, how many people are accessing the LawHelp New York microsite. So that's some of the information that we're going to be paying a lot of attention to over the summer as we expand the project. And we have a few more questions that I can read out. Do you have any recommendations for accessibility testing of the content within the forms? And I'm not sure if I understand that question. Do you have any recommendations for accessibility testing of the content within the forms? So is that like, for instance, WCAG accessibility of the interview interface, or a question about the output? Or Dan, do you have a sense of what that is?
Yeah, I mean, to me at least, that question speaks towards, how do we assess that these tools are accessible? Where accessibility can mean both, and I think this is sort of getting at this next project as well from Diana Glick, is There's accessibility for folks that are differently abled, right? Who might need to use screen readers, who have different sorts of physical impairments that prevent them from accessing the tools. And another way that we look at accessibility is are these tools actually able to be used by the folks that we're intending them for? Clearly, we are really targeted on these tools being used by folks that are facing, displacement and gentrification, which tend to be, lower income, working class communities of color who are really sort of pushed to the fringes of the neighborhoods that we live in here in New York. Those are also folks that could be more likely to be from immigrant communities who are non-native English speakers. So there's definitely a universe of tools. Speaking towards that first type of accessibility, there's a universe of online tools that you can find that help to assess. They do some broad assessments. Automated tools that look at is your tool, what does your website look like if it's only being used as by a screen reader? Are you meeting that specification? Do you have the right sort of tags within your code in place? That those sorts of different sorts of interaction styles can be met. So that there are definitely things on that front. But I think for JustFix and my personal approach is really focusing on the human level. So of course, nothing replaces direct user testing. Engaging with folks who are representative of the universe of what you're sort of designing towards. And that's based on those initial assessments that you do. So, not coming in with preconceived notions, but, your assessment should inform who your user types are to inform then who the folks that you should be testing with should be. But, another major thing that I think we've been able to rely upon here at JustFix is also leveraging the sorts of relationships and partnerships that we have with tenant organizations, with the legal aid organizations. So working, with tenants as well as tenant organizers, who are really folks that are also interfacing with tenants every day. They build a lot of institutional knowledge of how they phrase different things. So we actually, you saw a little bit in the interview around, the questions around landlord harassment that at the moment of our testing are still being left in the sort of legalese form that the forms are asking about. We have actually been gathering a huge wealth of worksheets, of training materials, all sorts of different resources that our partners use to ask tenants those questions, that they have already done a lot of that legwork of formatting them in a way that makes them more accessible for folks to understand. So, really relying on some of those relationships has been really useful to us in giving us a bit of a leg up in the process. So we're able to adapt a harassment flyer that one of our organizing partners has and look at the language they use to then see as inspiration for how we put those questions in the form.
Thanks, Dan. That's really helpful. And thank you also for the presentation more generally. We have one last question that I'm going to read out. That's I think Kiskaya can help with. Is LawHelp New York going to expand as a portal to allow the capability of these kinds of ask and refine tools in JustFix to be accessible through LawHelp New York directly and or for more case types?
Yes, thank you for that question. It was perfect. It was a perfect segue. So what we're really trying to do with LawHelp New York is make sure that we can leverage these tools and they're easily accessible, and they can be found either through the main website, or we created a microsite, which we created because it's for a specific population dealing with a specific problem. And so we just redesigned the microsite based on some feedback. And I could, can I show my screen? Well, I could, I can put a link into the info section. Hold on. So what we're trying to do is we try to set it out as a step-by-step process, and we try to do it in that way because we want this to seem as if it's a process that anybody can manage. Are people seeing my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we tried to set it up as a step-by-step process, and this was done with Legal Services NYC and with JustFix. And the reason why we did that was because we knew that many people were going to have to represent themselves in these cases, especially individuals, especially as more funding is going to right to counsel and eviction cases. And so we wanted people to know that this is a process that is doable, help them get the knowledge that they need, and also build their confidence so that they can break it down. And so we tried to set it up where people understand that there are different steps that they can take that leads to different aspects. And so some of these steps will lead to resources of LSNYC, and some of these steps will lead to resources for JustFix. So for instance, asking and writing, we have an example where people can write a sample letter to the landlord, and they can also use a JustFix.NYC app to write a letter to their landlord. And it will walk them through the process as well. And then we tried to have information about, okay, starting the HPA action, there's a video that was, I'm sorry, I'm hearing myself twice. Oh, so there was a video that was created through funding from LSC and also from another funder. And we created a video that just walks people through the process of once they get into the courtroom, okay, here's what will happen, here are the things that they could expect. And we made an entryway so that they can either get to the LHI form alone or the JustFix and LHI integration. And we want to make sure that this can be possible more because there are many tools, and JustFix is on the ground doing sort of grassroots organizing work, but also within the community, so they can in real time test all of these different resources and tools that are out there and get the feedback back to us and to LSNYC and to LHI so that we can improve the user experience on our site. So it feels like this is a great project, and this is the kind of project that we want to do more of. And this site is also accessible through the main LawHelp New York website.
And the question also included moving to other areas of Law Quisqueya. Any thoughts on that?
So that will depend on funding. What we're trying to do, if we're going to create a microsite around a specific, we try to do it for specific populations dealing with very specific legal issues where we can integrate different tools and resources from different platforms and also different projects. But if we're seeing that there's a need in another area, we would work on that. There'd have to be funding tied to it for us to be able to build that out. But we do have a microsite on consumer self-help resources where you're able to find information about a triage tool that was created through a consortium of legal services providers in New York City, and also another triage tool for Western New York and Central New York providers, where people are able to walk through a process to get information about consumer resources. So we have done it in other areas, but usually it's tied to a specific funding source and need, of course.
Okay, great. We have a few minutes left, so I once again thank Dan and Quisqueya for joining us, and just walk through a few announcements quickly. But we've added a link to the JustFix.NYC website into the chat box, as well as a link to the microsite that Quisqueya talked about. So if you have questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us later on. So just quickly, I'll share my screen in one moment. We just wanted to remind you of some of the federal funding opportunities available to people who have existing or new online forms projects, and just send a quick congrats to the people who did the hard work of submitting a TIG application earlier in the year. For people who have LHI content, we're going to be releasing second quarter reports next week. We've gotten over 500,000 interviews between January and June 23rd, and we're exceeding our usage when compared to the same time period in 2018. So you'll see the full second quarter stats next week, but wanted to give you a sneak peek of what that's looking like. We also want to make sure that people are aware that they're able to pull their own reports and get some feedback on the people that have been using the partner accessible reporting tool. So we'll ask about that a little bit more in our newsletter. We talked a little bit about in the last call about the possibility of adding additional languages to the LHI site. So we want to hear from you if you're thinking about developing content in French and Polish, or if you have requests and specific projects in mind around other languages. And we want to encourage you to join our next call. It's going to be held on July 23rd. I'll send the link to register for this and the remaining calls of the year in the chat box. And I'll ask Mark if he wants to say anything about our July call.
Just briefly, that Quentin Steenhouse and I will review a paper we did for the AI and Law Conference in Montreal last week about how do we ensure quality in these kinds of applications. Usability is one thing, but actual substantive correctness is another. So we'll talk about that second topic at our next call.
Okay, thank you all. Go ahead, Claudia.
Yeah, Miranda, just also a reminder that LSC has opened the proposals for their ITC conference. The deadline is July 17th, and they have some new types of sessions, including shorter sessions for 30 minutes, strategy sessions, and also, of course, the rapid fire type talks. So if anybody is interested in thinking or doing an online forum call, feel free to reach out.
Okay, thanks, Claudia. Thanks, everyone, for joining. And the recording for today's presentation will be up a little bit later this week. Thank you again, Kiskaya and Dan, for your awesome presentation. And we hope that many of you will join us next month. Have a great week.
Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you, Miranda.